Hello and welcome back to another episode of Generation Cult, the show about people who grew up in secretive authoritarian groups, also known as cults, and what happened to them after they left. I'm Deanna, and welcome to the third episode of Season 4. This is a special day for our guest, Kate Gale, who is the publisher, co-founder, and managing editor of Red Hen Press, and the editor of the Los Angeles Review, as well as a teacher of poetry at Chapman University. He is also the author of 7 books of poetry. Today is special because it marks the launch of her debut novel entitled Under the Neon Sun. The novel follows a young, queer, unhoused girl trying to live her life, get her education without support, after leaving her upbringing in a secluded, high-demand group. Kate, our guest today, drew in part from her own experience to write this character, as she herself grew up in a similar circumstance. When she was 3 years old, her mother joined an isolated Christian cult in the Northeast, Highview Church Farm, or The Farm. She left when she was 18 with a dog, a harmonica, and $2, and that's about it. We're going to talk about Kate. We're going to talk about her book. We're going to talk about her life. I'm excited. Let's do this. Kate, welcome. I'm happy to have you here today.
It's so great to be here with you.
Congratulations on your book launch. Where can people find it?
So it's definitely in a lot of indie bookstores. Also, of course, at the press, 3 Rooms Press, and Barnes & Noble, but indie bookstores everywhere.
And what's it about?
So it does follow a girl who grows up in a cult, and she and her brother were at the cult. And at some point, her father, who is not at the cult, visits her brother to see sort of if her brother is worth saving. And you find out sort of sideways in the story that he realizes that her brother is gay. He doesn't realize she is because she's very young at the time, but he does realize that her brother is gay and decides he's not worth saving from the cult. And I come back to that whole idea, throughout this, because one of the things I'm interested in is that a lot of the kids who end up homeless in California end up there because they're part of the LGBTQ group. So in my case, I was cult, and that was part of what inspired this. But in Mia's case, she ends up on her own and decides to get a college education. And obviously, one of the challenges of a college education is that so many kids go into student debt, which Mia decides she wants to avoid. She's heard horrible things about student debt. She wants to avoid it. And so she ends up living in her car. And 1 out of 5 community college students in California live in their cars, which is a terribly high number.
So I know this is fiction, but how close does it follow your own life?
Well, I did grow up in a cult, and when I left, like Mia, I did clean houses and take care of kids because I didn't have a whole lot of skill sets, and I did that for a while when I was in college. And like Mia, I also really struggled with food insecurity and economic insecurity and didn't really know how to manage my life. I wasn't also really making plans. There's part of this when, one of the adults in her life asks her about her plans for the future. And she's just kind of like fairly vague about her plans. And I continued to be pretty vague about my plans right up through graduate school because I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to do once I wasn't in college anymore. And I think that partly comes from growing up somewhere where no one around you has a, quote, real job. And so you can't quite imagine what you would do out in the world, so to speak. And so there's many things about Mia's life that I kind of stole from my own life. However, I think that Mia has a bit more confidence than I did and a bit more ability to make friends. I think I had a great deal of difficulty trusting people after I left the farm. I didn't really understand a lot of how friendships worked. And she, I think, does a little bit better job. And I think that her friendships really serve her well as a bit of a chosen family.
And Mia, of course, is the main character in your book. So Mia is a student and she is living in her car. She's unhoused. And this is something you experienced personally. And you actually recently wrote an op-ed in the LA Times about protecting unhoused students. And I was hoping you wouldn't mind talking to me about that because that was a really interesting piece.
Yeah, so Part of the reason I was so interested in diving into this project is that when I came to California, I started teaching at community colleges. That was the first place I started teaching. My own experience with community colleges had been really, really good. I thought it was kind of a doorway into education. And so I really wanted to come back and teach at community colleges. And the longer I taught there, the more I started realizing how on the edge many California community college students were. And at this point, 1 in 5 California community college students is unhoused. So that's what I was writing the article about. There's one community college, Long Beach, which has set up these safe parking lots for students. And I really think the other I think there's 119 altogether, but I think the others should as well, because that way, if you are unhoused, you would know where you could park near campus and you'd feel like you were going to be safe. And obviously, hopefully, that kind of safe parking lot would lead to the possibility of affordable housing for community college students. Because if you made the decision to go to college and make your life better, you're clearly on the right path.
One thing in your novel, the character, Mia, had parked her car on the property of a woman she'd been friendly with, and I thought that was interesting. That seemed so personal in a way. I was wondering if that was something that you had experienced as well.
Well, I did on occasion park on someone's land. There is a person that character is loosely based on who has allowed people to park on her land in Topanga. And I told her as the novel was being written that I was loosely basing a character on her, and she was kind of amused. But I do think one of the things I wanted to lean into in this story is that there are people who have really worked hard to help unhoused people in California, throughout California. And the other thing being this whole idea of there are people who started in one place in the novel and then changed their mind, like went in a better direction. Because I think that it's just so easy in 2024 to think of Americans as either good people or bad people. And my daughter is gay and has an amazing wife. And one of the things she taught me very early was we would be encountering someone who would be homophobic. And I would just be in my sort of fight mode. And my daughter would say, give them a chance to change their mind about me. And so I thought about that throughout writing this novel, this whole idea of letting my characters evolve and change and thinking what pressures on them would cause them to change. Because, when I first left the farm, I was this very odd little person who really had no ego, was very strange, did not know how to make friends, and obviously gradually changed. It took some time, though.
Let's talk about the farm. Tell me about this farm. It's called the Highview Church Farm, and it's led by somebody named George Eversfield. Please tell me more about this man and this group.
So he collected his followers by traveling up and down the Atlantic seaboard and through New England. And he got a group of people to agree to come to New Hampshire. He bought 1,000 acres there, just under 1,000 acres there. And everyone was going to live in this very rural environment there and do what he said for the rest of their life. And then they would get to go to heaven. And so he had the adults live in one area, and 2 miles away, the children lived in another area. We all slept in sleeping bags on the floor, and we went to school like maybe 3 hours in the morning, and then we worked the rest of the time. And so our schooling was pretty limited. And usually at 13 or 14, people would drop out of school and start working. So at 13, my sister dropped out of school and joined the chainsaw crew because there's a lot of felling of trees and selling off of logs. So there wasn't a whole lot. Education wasn't all that important. What was most important was work. So people were working all the time for George, and George would give everybody their jobs, and George would tell you who you were going to marry or guide you in the direction of the person you were going to be allowed to marry. But yeah, so George was ruling every part of your life while you were there. And there were some people that left at some point because they just couldn't put up with the rules. But my mother, I think, was glad to be there because she wasn't going to have to raise her kids, and she wasn't going to have to figure out her life. And so she lived with all the adults in the adult area. and saw us a couple times a year. And I think she was just kind of glad to wash her hands of us.
Wow. Well, so how many siblings did you have? Or do you?
One. I have one sister. Yeah, one sister. And I actually weirdly didn't see her very often because she was older and she was in a different squad. So we were all in these different squads. Because George had been in the military, he was in the Navy, British Navy. He tried to run the farm as much as possible, at least the school part of it, like it was the British Navy. And he would have us marching and just doing all of our drills and everything as if we were in the Navy. And naturally, some of the people that left there did end up joining the American military because I think they felt well suited to do so.
Wow. And so your mom joined when you were really, really young.
Mm-hmm.
You were how old?
I was 3, and it's like I feel like I have one memory before we went there. So I think my mother was given a sort of test to see if she was worthy of going there, and she was told to, quote, teach us to swim or something, but she was supposed to toss us in the river. And it was just, a pretty cold river in Maine. And so we, quickly were able to swim ashore, but it was rocky. And so I think me especially, I was bleeding afterwards, but she was not supposed to say anything as we were swimming ashore in this rocky river. And then after that, she was allowed to join. And so I have this very vague memory of the blood running down my arms after that little swim in the river. And then I remember pulling up to the farm and my sister going off. And I was left in a room by myself. And they took away my doll. I had a doll. And I was given, nothing and left in that room. I hadn't had dinner, so I kind of ate whatever was in the room, which was toothpaste and Vaseline.
Oh,
yeah, so I got sick at midnight and set the room on fire and tried to climb out the window.
Whoa.
So things were not going well, even there in the beginning.
Wow.
So there was a decision made that I was kind of a demonic child for some reason right quickly in the beginning.
But they let you guys stay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so what was the living situation for the children?
So we were divided by age, certainly by gender also. And so I would have been in a group with kids that would have been roughly my age, all sleeping on the floor in sleeping bags, getting up at 5 a.m, quickly, getting dressed, going to devotions, and then doing, quote, what they call joy jobs, which were just like quick jobs around the place, then doing school quickly in the winter, and then working for 5 hours in the afternoon, and then devotions again in bed. And then again, bed is just you're sleeping in a sleeping bag on the floor. And one of the things I didn't hear about this until literally a few years ago, I was listening to someone do a reading about Romanian orphans. And they were talking about how the Romanian orphans would rock back and forth and kind of make this moaning. And I immediately remembered that, especially whoever the smallest girls were in the room doing that rocking thing. They would sit up with their sleeping bag and kind of fetal position, rock themselves and kind of moan at night. And sometimes I might tell everybody a story, but sometimes I might not because I was afraid of getting caught. Sometimes you could just hear this low moaning throughout the room. And when I heard that later, I realized that's orphan rock.
Yeah.
Everybody doing this self-soothing thing,
Yeah. You remember how you felt at the time?
I really wanted to cheer the other kids up. And so if I thought no one was going to come by, I would try to tell the kids a story and get the room to settle down. But I had very much said to myself every night, you have only you have only you have only yourself. So it's funny that from a very small age, I was very aware of only having my own self to rely on and no one else to sort of as another person to toss things back and forth with, or even tell whatever I would have thought my troubles were too. And so I think that not having any reference point outside yourself for a very long time allows you to become pretty sort of crazily introverted.
So were you already kind of a writer back then? You said you made up stories for the other kids. It sounds like you already had this kind of creative spirit going.
Yeah, so I was always making up stories for the other kids in which, like, we're the heroes and we live in a world where there are no grown-ups. You look around without a grown-up in sight, and we're heroically doing all this stuff. And so as soon as I left, I started writing stories. Of course, I didn't really know how a story went, but I very much wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to live in a world of books. So I immediately started hanging out at the town library and reading books, and I was extremely excited to be in a world where there was, it seemed to me, an endless amount of books.
So what about poetry caught on with you?
Well, okay, so oddly, my first poetic experience, I think some people might not see it as poetry, but I certainly do, was the Psalms. And there was the part of the Bible I think I liked the best. So keep in mind, we're reading the Bible all the time.
Mm.
And part of the Bible I liked the best was the Psalms. They felt very poetic to me. I'd memorized a lot of them. And so when I left, I kind of wanted to take that as my jumping off point and think about writing poetry. And so all the first poetry that I wrote, which was horrible, unfortunately, I burnt it all, was kind of, bad nature poems. Because if you think about it, a lot of the Psalms has to do with the natural world. But I didn't understand what a poem was supposed to be until much later, studying with Norman Dubie and Peggy Shoemaker and having the fortune to have some good poetry teachers. I started to understand. But I really loved the language of poetry, even from the beginning.
Mm. Yeah, I really liked your poem, Chickens. Found that poem that you wrote, and it made me think of what I imagined your experience to be on the farm, feeding the chickens, dealing with the animals. Is my impression right? I assume that's what it came from, your experience growing up.
Yeah, it did. So for whatever reason, George was always getting these large numbers of animals. So we had 1,000 chickens. Obviously there's the eggs, but then also there's the killing of the chickens and, making chicken pie and chicken this and chicken that. We also had 1,000 sheep, and the sheep had to be sheared and the wool had to be made into sweaters. They also had to be herded around. So there was a lot of care of animals at the farm. George really felt that having animals was extremely important for us.
Mm. So that was the farm's thing, was animals. And then you also mentioned logging?
Yes. So because there's 1,000 acres, there was a lot of logging. And because there's a lot of logging and there's a lot of people doing this logging that shouldn't be, logging is just by nature a dangerous occupation. My sister ended up cutting her leg open with a chainsaw, I think when she was 14 or 15. My mother was in a logging accident. My mother was a fairly small person, maybe 130 pounds. Not a large woman, maybe 5'4", 5'5". And for whatever reason, she was on the logging crew. And she was cutting down trees, and a chainsaw bucked back on her and cut her head open. And so she ended up in the hospital, and they thought, she might not make it at first, but she did. So this kind of accident was fairly common at the farm. Somebody else had half their hand cut off when they were doing some sort of work with the wood. And George would always say when these kind of things happened that the person was just, quote, not in the will of God. And I mean, when it happened to my mother, I remember being old enough to feel angry at George and think she shouldn't have been on the logging crew. This is a man's job. I mean, or a big person's job. I don't want to gender it here, but in other words, a big solid person should be doing this. At the time, I would have thought it was a man's job, but in my world today, I would just say a big solid person who's physically equipped for logging should be doing it. And my mother was not. Nor was she someone who was generally aware of safety. She was in more car accidents than anyone I've ever met. So I was angry at George, but, that wasn't going to help me, and it's interesting to me even looking back because I had so little relationship with her that they took me to see her at Hanover Hospital in Dartmouth and that I felt sympathy or I felt something, when I saw her all bandaged up with her head and everything. Because by the time I left at 18 and I knew I was never going to see her and my sister again, I felt a twinge like, oh, now I'm really alone. But it didn't feel like this is going to be hard. it kind of felt like, oh, well, big adventure coming, you know?
Yeah. And where was your dad?
Yeah, so that's another interesting thing. So they had split when she had decided to join up. He met George and wasn't impressed. And he had met this other woman. I don't know how much of it was that he had decided to go back to his roots and marry a Jewish woman. I don't know if that was part of the appeal of getting divorced from my mom. So I wasn't around then, but he did end up marrying a Jewish woman, and he and the woman drove to Vegas together, got the divorce, and then he ended up having 2 children with her. And I called him after I left the farm, and he drove to New Hampshire to meet me. So by this time, I would have been 18, and it's funny to think that he would have been like maybe 40. He wasn't that old, you know, because he had been so young when he became a father. But he was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he met me, and I was living in my car at the time, and he said, "Where are you living?" And I said, "I'm sleeping in my car." And he said, "What kind of car?"
Wow.
Literally, yeah, had no interest at all in my life and in getting to know me at all. And at that point, I mean, like in my whole life, I think I might have seen him 5 times.
Wow.
But yeah, I would say that my impression of him was that he didn't have much interest in my sister or I. It was sort of like he had just wiped us out of his mind.
Wow.
And moved on.
Yeah.
To his next family. I have met now all of my siblings, and they turned out to be, you know, really interesting and lovely people. He ended up altogether having 6 children.
Oh.
We all met at his funeral, and it was the first time the 6 of us had all met. But yeah, I don't think that being a father was something that he also was really well suited for either.
Mm. So going back to before you left this group, how much interaction did you have with people outside the farm? Did people ever visit, and did you ever actually leave the property?
So there were very few visits. There's one picture I have of my sister and I and my 2 cousins. So my mother's sister visited once, but that's the only time I ever remember, and I don't know why they visited. I don't know if they were just curious how we were doing and wanted to check in. But there was that one visit. But basically, people from the outside were very much discouraged from ever visiting the farm. And once you were there, you didn't really visit. You weren't just going for Christmas with your friends outside. You weren't going over for beer or something. First of all, you weren't allowed to drink alcohol, but you wouldn't have been visiting anyone on the outside at all. So again, in the whole time, I remember one time that there was this visit. In terms of us going to the outside, for the most part, like the clothes were just kind of recirculated, and if somebody joined, their clothes would be dumped into the whole, this quote shop called the 30 by 40 shop, where all the clothes would be hung and you could go and sort of rummage and see if there was something else you needed. But of course, there's the shoe problem. So at some point, you're going to need shoes, particularly in New Hampshire in the winter. And so I think like once a year or something, we would be taken to town to get us shoes. And at the time, it didn't occur to me where my mother was getting the money to buy these shoes. But by the time I was an adult, I found out she'd gotten that money from my father. So my father had been sending child support that whole time, and that's what she bought the shoes with. I don't think it was a lot of money, but it was enough to do something like do a shoe trip. And we weren't supposed to talk with people outside because, of course, they're sinners. And so we couldn't talk with them. But, you know, I remember thinking the whole trip into town was kind of interesting to get the shoes. And sometimes we'd go to a thrift store to get a little bit more clothing if we were short something. Other than that, eventually the farm established a sort of branch in British Columbia. And that was for draft dodgers. So again, it started in the 60s. So the draft dodging for the Vietnam War would have swept through those years. So they had to get the boys out at some point, and they sent them to Canada to be in Vancouver Island. And so we were put on a bus and sent to Vancouver Island several times and then just kind of camped out on Vancouver Island in the summer. And on those trips, we crossed over on the ferries and kind of went around on the ferries and tried to chat with other people a little bit, which we probably weren't supposed to do, but it was just like that was a trip that felt a little bit freer. The big thing that I remember, though, was that eventually there were some people who left, some kids who left the farm, went back to live with their parents, and complained to their parents that there was too much abuse, physical abuse at the farm, like kids being beaten. And so the state of New Hampshire began to investigate the farm. And so it seemed like every year or two, there would be another group of people sent in to ask us questions. And they would ask us questions, and then they would observe us for a few days. And we would be skipping and clapping and doing everything in unison because we would be told to do all this while these people were there. And when they asked us how we were told to say, I'm happy, healthy, and helpful. And so every child would say the same thing. I'm happy, healthy, and helpful. And then when they saw us like performing, we would all be skipping and clapping. I don't know why that didn't seem like a warning sign, but
it's suspicious to me. Yeah. So how did you see the outside world, though? Did it seem unsafe to you? Did you believe what George was saying, or were you curious?
Yeah, I mean, I was somewhat curious. So eventually I had a bicycle that I guess fixed up and was allowed to ride. And I rode this bicycle a few times to this pond that was like 6 miles away and met this girl there several times. And the girl told me that I should leave and that if I left, she wasn't like offering to help me or anything, but she was like, if you leave, you could get a job. You should wait until you're 18 because otherwise you will just be sent back. And so she kind of was giving me some ideas. And she also told me that people outside the farm thought the farm people were weird. And it was like my first look at the farm from the outside. She was like, oh, you're one of those farm people. You're weird. Yeah. And even the first time we had the conversation, I remember thinking, this is why we're not allowed to talk with outsiders. Because she's saying these things. But I was curious, and the next time I was there, I was looking for her, and finally I found her again. We had another conversation. The first time she told me she was going to live her life with horses, and she just wanted to have a horse, you know. And and we had horses at the farm, so I didn't remember thinking, why are horses such a big deal? But the second time I saw her, she said, I'm through with the horse's dream. I'm going to find a boy. And I thought, well, boys seemed even less interesting than horses, but at the time to me. But she gave me little ideas of things to think about. The idea that I could get a job, and you know, she was like, most people can support themselves, and I was like, honey, okay. She didn't really say what they did, but she just seemed to be fairly confident that it was possible. But also was very clear, don't run away till you're 18.
So was there any one thing that made you decide I'm going to leave, or was it you turning 18 and deciding let's see what happens?
So I turned 18 one spring, and something else happened that spring, which was sort of a turning point. And it was interesting because later I read this book by Jamaica Kincaid, and she talks about like herself deciding to leave the islands after she had been sick and she was home, and she had this like hibernation phase. And so that spring, by this time the farm had a restaurant, and it wasn't very successful because they were closed on we were closed on Saturdays because of the Lord's Sabbath. But we did have this restaurant, and I was in the restaurant cooking, and there was an explosion. Basically, I was told to like turn on this one valve and light it, and there was a valve beside it that had been left uncapped from a French fry maker that had been taken out of there. And so it's like a very typical farm thing where safety was just not really taken care of. And suddenly there's just like when the gas was turned on, there's just massive explosion that rocked this entire restaurant. And I mean, the restaurant just like boom, boom, like almost like there'd been an earthquake. And I was on fire. Other things are on fire. Oh. And when I became conscious a couple days later. I mean, they had me in ice water, but they didn't take me to the hospital. They just kept me in this room and kept changing my burn bandages for a couple months. And so I had 2 months of just being alone. I wasn't working. Someone would come in, change the bandages, and then keep going. And during that time, all I thought about was who I was going to be when I left. And it was just like, I had never had that long. I hadn't even had a day to myself ever, but I had 2 months. And I watched spring happen out the window. And I knew by the time I walked out that door that I was going to leave. And by September, I'd walked down the farm road and I was gone.
And what was the response to you leaving? Or was there a response at all?
My mother was quite upset, surprisingly. She was the one that gave me the $2 so that I could have some money. I had no idea, like, what I was going to do with that, whether it was a lot of money. I just didn't know anything about money. I didn't have a Social Security number. I didn't have a driver's license. So what I was going to do with $2, I didn't know. But my mother was just like, you're going to go to hell. And I have to say that even looking back and thinking about the adults that were there, I'm sure everyone thought I would just come back in a few days. I had run away before and just come back. And so I think people thought that I would run off somewhere and come back in a few days. And even when I did manage to find a place to live, like that winter, where I was living was a couple miles away. They came down and were like, "Yeah, you want to come back?"
Yeah.
But by that time, I was saving up money for a bus ticket to leave, and I was bound and determined never to come back.
How did you do it? I mean, you just walked out with $2. It doesn't sound like you really got how little money that was. Did you just kind of right place, right time, find a job and go from there? Like, how did that work out?
Well, so as I said, I started hanging out at this library, and there was this woman that was coming into the library. And of course, she did know that I was a farm person, because it would have been very obvious. Like, I have the farm haircut is a certain haircut. Also, just sort of a blank look on my face and the weird clothing. The whole thing says farm person. And so she was like, so what are you doing here? Did you just leave the farm or something? And I was like, yeah, I did. And so she said that she was looking for a live-in babysitter, and I could come and live at her house and stay in the attic and take care of her kid. And that was my first job. She said she would pay me $15 a week. I thought that was so much money. And I was pretty excited right away and moved into her attic.
Great. And at what point did you start going to school?
So I got out of New Hampshire within a year or so. I'd saved up and I decided to move to Virginia. And I was dating this guy, and he was just like, God doesn't want you to go to college. And at the point that I heard that, I was just like, I had never even thought of going to college. But as soon as he started bossing me around and telling me not to go to college, I just decided I had to start right away.
Of course. That's exactly what you're going to go do now. Yeah.
Right. I was just like, okay, sign me up. What did we do at college, So I stopped by a college the next day, and I was like, I'm ready to go to college. And they had me talk with a counselor, and they had me take placement tests. And they were like, oh, you can go right into freshman English and freshman math. And I was like, oh, okay. So they got me, they were figuring out what classes I could take. And the counselor said, well, what is your major going to be? And I was like, oh, what do I need a major for? And she's like, that's for what you're going to do when you graduate. And I was like, oh, okay. How long is that going to take? She's like, 4 years. And I was like, whoa, what if the rapture happens first? And then she's like, well, if the rapture happens, you'll be partway through college. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And then she said, so what are you going to do? Just if the rapture doesn't happen and you were to graduate, what would you do? And I was like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. But I think what I'll do is I'll travel around the country and pick fruit. She was like, great. Okay. So what would you want to study in college? And I was like, Spanish. I definitely want to speak Spanish so that I can speak Spanish with some of the other people when I have picked fruit, because that is one of the things I had done by that time. It was one of my again, my short list of skill sets, I had noticed that some of the people spoke Spanish. So I wanted to be able to speak Spanish. And so she's like, okay, great. You can be a Spanish major. And so I just launched right into that at the community college. And oddly, after I was there for a year, I decided to go to Arizona State University a bit on a whim. I wanted to get to the West Coast. So I drove to Arizona. And part of it was that I really felt like Richmond, Virginia, which is where I was living, was very racist. And I wanted to get away from that. And oddly, it took me a while to figure out that Arizona also had some race problems. Yes. So at Arizona State University, I met Rita Dove, who was teaching in the English department there. And I remember she asked me what my major was. And I was just about to say, I'm a Spanish major because I'm going to be a traveling fruit picker. And then I must have been out of the cult like for a year and a half or something. And I was like, that doesn't sound good. So I said, I think I'm going to become an English major. And she was like, oh, what a good idea. So I eventually changed and became an English major without any idea of what anybody with an English major did for a living. I'm still not quite sure, but
they're right.
Yes. You can do, actually with an English major, you can do many, many things.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's pretty amazing. I mean, you walked out without, a lot of education. You went to community college, which is great. I love community college. That's how I started my education. I didn't have much money either. Such a great way to get started if you have limited resources, and you went to Arizona State. And I mean, how was that? Did you feel different than the other students? Like, how did you relate to people around you during this time? Or did you even think about it?
Well, in Richmond, weirdly, I felt more different that I ended up feeling once I got to Arizona. In Richmond, if I went on dates with people, for the most part, there would be this question of like, well, so how old are your parents? It's like, well, my parents are 40 years old. Are they alive and well? Yes. Could I meet them? No. So there's something about having parents that are alive and well and living on the Eastern Seaboard who are not available for anyone to meet at any time. That's awkward. It felt like I didn't want to roll out that cult story every time I met somebody. Whereas somehow once I got to Arizona and then particularly California, where it feels like everybody's reinventing themselves, it was less weird to just be like, my family's on the East Coast. I don't see them anymore. That's a whole nother long story. I'm not even going to go into it. That was an easier thing to say once I got to both Arizona and California than it had been in Virginia. Whereas I think at least where I was, it felt like people were more closely tied. And also the younger you are, the harder it is to explain I'm 18. I have no contact with my parents. The older you get, the easier that becomes.
Yeah, I could see how that would be awkward. And then describing how you grew up. I used to call it dropping the C-bomb because you definitely don't want to lead with it. And I learned the hard way. You say it, you drop the C-bomb. Oh, yeah, I grew up in a cult. And it's like all conversation stops and everyone kind of looks at you and you're like, oh, great. I guess that's all we're going to talk about. And
right
right now. I feel you on that. So so you went from that to now being a publisher. You have Red Hen Press. You're a poet. Just so interesting, your journey. What would you say were, other than the money and the connections part of it, the not having the parents, the support, what would you say were the hardest parts of that, just socially?
I would say that making friends was difficult. I would say connecting with other people, learning to trust other people was difficult. I would also say that what helped me was that I certainly had quite a bit of work ethic and certainly quite a bit of drive. And I don't know if that came from working all the time at the farm, but I did have that. But I would say that the part that's hardest from growing up there is this sort of fear-based life that you grow up with at the farm. And so when something bad happens, you tend to catastrophize. It feels like the end of the world because you've been living in this scenario where the world was always about to end. So when we were at the farm, George was always telling us every year that the world was going to end. So I think the first time I was like 10, the world was going to end when I was 11, and then when I was 12. And eventually we started building these trimarans so that we could sail around the world. And I'm not sure how that was going to help us for the end of the world, but it was going to like give us some protection. The Russians were always about to attack. We were always like on the edge of the quote end of the world. We were always doing all these drills for the end of the world. And so we're very much in these end of days kind of people. And so you're always in this high adrenaline state collectively and personally. So personally, you're always afraid of being beaten and getting in trouble. And then collectively as a group, we're always preparing for the end of days. And so I think that if you're living a life fully, as I think I'm doing, you are going to make mistakes. And I have really made some royal mistakes. And also some bad stuff is going to happen. And so your way of processing that is what makes you build a character. That's what makes you human. And do you learn from your mistakes and try to move on? When you have obstacles in your life, do you try to overcome them? Obviously, all of that, I do try to learn from my mistakes. I try to overcome obstacles. But I think that people that do those effectively, first of all, are able to stop, take a breath. This isn't the first or last mistake I've ever made. I'm going to learn from this mistake and move on. Or when they have a big obstacle, they get the smartest people they know to talk with them about it and try to figure it out. Whereas I think that if you've grown up in a cult environment, in both of those cases, I've made a mistake or there is a massive obstacle. It's like, this is it, this is it, this is it, this is it. You know, there's this thing going in your head that catastrophizes it to the nth degree. And none of that helps you to move forward, either to figure out your mistake and apologize and become a better human being, or to solve the obstacle. So I would say, if you were asking me what the biggest difficulty coming out of that, it would be those two things that are sort of combined.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, tell me a little bit about your life now.
Well, I came to California to be a writer and ended up starting this publishing house. And now I'm working with this absolutely fantastic group of young people at Red Hen Press. There's 12 of us. They're all just so energetic, dynamic, and smart. And so I just feel privileged every day to come to work with this group. I also feel lucky that I get to do my own writing some of the time. It is a bit of a struggle sometimes to find the time for it, but I do. Right now I'm on book tour, but when I finish this book tour, I'm going to jump back into this project I'm working on. So I feel lucky that I do have time to write, and I feel lucky to have this fantastic group to work with. And I also just feel like whenever I think about things I'm grateful for in my life, I start with the fact that I got out. And I got out, I got to live in the world, and then I got to live in a world of books. I have two amazing children who got married in the last couple of years, each of them to great people. And the six of us as a family are really, really tight. And, I just feel like what I wanted when I left was to live in a world of books and find love. And that's what I've done.
Congratulations on that, on all your success. And thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. It's so great to meet you. And I wish for great success for you too.